Thank you for attending today's webinar. We are waiting for a few more moments to get started as some stragglers are coming in, so please stand by. We'll have webinar beginning momentarily. Thank you. Hello, I'm John Klobuchar with InEight, and I'd like to welcome you to our latest webinar in our Planning, Scheduling, and Risk series. Today's webinar is titled, Protect Profit Margin, Reduce Risk Before You Bid. Our presenters today are Dr. Dan Patterson, who is InEight's Chief Design Officer, and Paul Self, Executive Vice President of Project Planning and Scheduling Solutions at InEight. If you have any questions as you watch today's webinar, please submit them in the box marked questions over on the right-hand side of your screen. Also, today's webinar is being recorded and we'll be sending out a link to the video within the next week. Once again, we're glad you joined us today. And now let me introduce Dan Patterson and Paul Self, who will take it from here. Gentlemen.
John, thank you very much for that warm welcome. And depending on where in the world you are dialing in from, a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name's Dan Patterson and Paul Self, and I will be spending the next 45 minutes or so sharing our thoughts on a topic that, Paul, I think it's fair to say we've discussed fairly frequently in recent months, and that is the science of risk analysis and risk management pertaining to scheduling, but very specifically the use case around really the applicability of conducting a risk analysis for a contractor organization. And I think what's really interesting about this is the fact that, you know, traditional risk analysis, I think, primarily has been seen as a reporting exercise. So in other words, let's run the analysis and report on our risk exposure. Whereas I think from a contractor perspective, there's a very, very valuable additional use case where by running the risk analysis, we can actually determine whether the bid that we're about to submit over to the owner is a competitively advantaged bid or not.
Right, and it really represents kind of an evolution of the risk process and tools that support that risk process tied to better supporting the contractor who's actually doing the work.
I agree 100%, and I think, you know, in simplistic terms, it's a proactive means of adjusting either upwards or downwards the total price that that you're going to use within your bid.
Absolutely.
I think taking just a step back for those that are perhaps less familiar with the concepts of risk analysis, you know, in many ways, when projects put together a cost and or a schedule forecast, those forecasts are rarely the most likely scenario. In reality, they're really the best case scenario. The reason being, they inherently don't take into account some of the bad things that may happen, whether it's, you know, quantity growth or less than optimum productivity rates, external impacts, things like that. And so, you know, really the whole science of risk analysis is to drive towards what we call a risk-adjusted forecast. So, you know, it's moving the needle from saying, okay, the most optimistic scenario is X to, well, our most likely scenario is Y. And the difference between those two is really the contingency that we should carry on the project.
Sure.
And go ahead, Paul.
Sure, and where this really starts to take shape and take form is when you look at the solutions that we've started to build here at InEight around our approach to risk management. The ability to move those levers and see the impact in real time makes it all that more valuable to a contractor organization that may not necessarily have the time to pass the information back to another solution that takes much longer to actually get the the output and the analysis from the risk process.
So you touch on something I think that's really key in that, historically, I think many contractor organizations, arguably while they're using a pseudo-scientific approach to calculating bid price and contingency and margin, at the end of the day, they've probably reverted back to using a historical, well, let's just throw 20% contingency at this and 15% margin. I think the luxury of the risk analysis is, we're moving from a single lens view of the bid and providing multiple scenarios and multiple outcomes. And I think that's obviously very, very valuable.
Yes. So
the purpose of today is not to walk through in detail, the mechanics of developing a risk-adjusted schedule and/or cost forecast, but really, again, as a primer, with regards to risk modeling, Paul, as with any system, there are inputs, there is an engine or analysis, and there are outputs. And that concept doesn't differ simply because we're looking at this from a contractor bid perspective. We absolutely still need to start with the underlying base model, which is our base cost and our underlying schedule. I think one very important point to raise, though, is when we're taking that base estimate, we need to strip out any contingency that may have been baked into the estimate. And often that goes well beyond just taking out the contingency line item. If our individual cost accounts or cost elements themselves have some degree of buffer or contingency embedded in them, you have to strip that out, because at the end of the day, what this analysis will come back and determine and reveal is how much additional contingency you need to add into that base. So you have to avoid double dipping. So make sure you absolutely strip out contingency. And then we get to the kind of the two key ingredients in the risk cake, if you like, and that is uncertainty and discrete risk events. So think of uncertainty, Paul, as kind of the wiggle, right? It's this isn't taking into account bad things that potentially could happen, weather events or industrial relations, labor strikes issues, things like that. That all falls into the discrete risk bucket of ingredients. Uncertainty is really more around, well, okay, perhaps we're not 100% certain as to the quantities that we will be asked to deliver, or perhaps the design isn't complete enough such that we absolutely know the quantities and even the productivity rates that we can achieve to execute that work. So again, it's very important to understand the two different types of variables that go into the risk model. The analysis part, and I know, Paul, this is something that you often raise and smile about. It isn't magic. It isn't this sort of magical black box. At the end of the day, it's brute force mathematics, and all it really is repeated simulation of execution of the project. And the way it works is, the computer takes into account all of those differing or potentially differing combinations of outcomes based on those risks and wiggle of uncertainty and quantity growth, and it runs thousands of iterations to account for those different scenarios, and then it comes back with a range of outcomes based on each of those iterations. And that leads us then to outputs. And again, we'll probably touch on this, Paul, in more detail later on, but things like, okay, how certain are we that our bid price is achievable? How much contingency versus how much base versus how much margin? And probably more importantly, what are the key drivers that is causing the need for that contingency? Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. And even taking it just one step further is also the ability to, as you're walking through that analysis, analyze alternate scenarios. So if certain risk events were to occur, then what does our scenario look like? Or if we had a true mitigation strategy in place that would eliminate specific risk events, what if we were to remove those from the model? So those alternate scenarios can be very valuable as you're considering both the contingency that you might include within your project and ultimately the bid price.
I think those alternate scenarios are arguably more valuable than just a single point view of your exposure. So talking of exposure, again, over the years, various risk vendors have come up with literally tens and tens of wonderful or arguably wonderful or more arguably or questionably useful risk reports. At the end of the day, in your risk toolkit, there are two fundamental risk reports that, as a contractor, you should absolutely use. Those two reports are shown on the screen here. On the left-hand side, we have what we call a risk histogram. It represents the range of outcomes from all of those iterations in the simulation. I call this the what report, Paul. It is, what is my exposure? What is my best case scenario, which in technical terms we call P0? What is our worst case scenario, our P100? And again, equally importantly, everything in between. And from a contractor bidding perspective, you don't want to go in at a P0. That's your most aggressive best case scenario. What it's telling you is you're most likely not going to hit that scenario. You're going to lose money. Conversely, the P100, the worst case scenario, that's kind of like your black swan scenario. Yes, you're going to cover yourself by bidding at that price, but the chance of you winning the bid at that P100, that very pessimistic price, is probably very, very low. So use the histogram as a yardstick as to where you should bid, at what level of confidence you should bid, and then the partner report is the tornado. It's the why. Why is my risk exposure and my contingency what it is? This tells you which risk events and quantity growths and so on and so forth are most likely to hurt you if assuming you win the bid and you get into execution.
Yeah, and similarly, where are those risk events hitting me, right? So what areas of my project do I need to concentrate my mitigation efforts on?
Yeah, because it pinpoints, it not only shows you which risks, but as you correctly point out, it shows you, which associated cost elements those risk events will hit upon. So before we get into another kind of contractor kind of view of risk analysis, I think it's fair to say that traditionally, certainly within CapEx and major construction projects, I think risk analysis has mostly been used by owner organizations. And from an owner perspective, really the value is being able to understand, certainly during project FID or the point at which we make a decision to invest in the project, such as sanction, to understand how much potential cost and time overrun there will be during execution, so that when we go and make that financial investment decision, we understand how much additional money we need to secure in order for the project to execute. So I think it's very much contingency based. I think when we get to the contractor perspective, and again, Paul, I know this is something that's very close to your heart. I think the lens and the focus is quite different.
It is. So when we work with owner organizations, right, the risk analysis and the outputs of that are largely used as a validation point at pre-FID, where they're seeking funding, or there's a concept select phase where they're trying to determine what the right scenario is to build the project. Whereas from a contractor's perspective, they're bidding on a specific project, right? And it's more evaluation of what's the right bid price that, one, keeps me competitive, but two, minimizes my exposure of margin erosion, right? And when we work with owners, we see schedule risk is often more impactful than cost risk in their world, largely because they're looking at risk around things like first production, and that's the turning point for revenue for that owner organization. At what point in time does this project move from being something that costs me money to making me money? Where conversely, on the contractor side, cost risk tends to be far more important than the schedule risk, as they try to protect that margin for their projects. And even when we start to look at the leading drivers, and what the organizations look at and what they experience in terms of what causes delays on their project, there's differences there as well, which is kind of interesting. So when we talk about owners, if there's a high degree of parallel scope, it creates a lot of risk on the project, right? If I'm talking about an offshore platform and how many persons on board can I have, and if I've got a higher degree of parallel scope, I don't have enough room for all of those people to actually execute the work. Competing work within the subcontractors or the contractor community that they're working with. Are there fabrication delays related to another owner being worked on within the fab yard? So interesting difference in terms of the drivers, right? On the contractor side, design and quantity growth are just, of paramount importance. Every time we get a new design, there's inevitably changes in those quantities. Inevitably, they're higher. And then productivity degradation, right? Can I perform this work as quickly as I have in the past? Are there project-specific characteristics that will allow me to go faster or slower? And on the contractor side, more often than not, it's labor, not material or equipment that drives the project risk. And it's more often than not, it's the productivity associated with that. And the final point I make, Dan, is as we work with owners, it's interesting. They take a much more kind of iterative approach to risk management, right? They will perform risk analysis at key milestones or phases within the contract, whereas on the contractor side, traditionally we've seen it where it happens, once, maybe twice over the life of a contract, which is also interesting.
So I think I've had a light bulb moment, Paul. I think what I'm really understanding from this slide is the fact that owner organizations, for the reasons you've described, are for the most part schedule sensitive. They look at their project as, okay, how quickly can we get this thing built so that our investment can turn into an asset, which then becomes operationally interesting with regards to revenue. On the contractor side, they are conversely much more cost sensitive because they, as per the definition of a project, it's a temporary endeavor for them. And at the end of the day, they're trying to maximize their margin on them working on this project.
I think that's key, and that brings us to talking a little bit about the building blocks, right?
It does. So, on the right-hand side here, we try to make this as simple and consumable as possible. While in reality, bid breakdowns can be highly complicated and have hundreds or thousands of line items, those bid packages really break down and can be categorized into 3 chunks: the base price, the contingency that we believe we need to add to that base to cover ourselves for unknown and risk, and then on top of that, margin. And I think from a risk analysis perspective, the best way I think of this is these 3 elements. In our example, we've got a base cost of $100, contingency 20, margin 15. Those 3 elements are all competing against each other. If indeed our base cost incurs unforeseen risk and/or uncertainty, the first thing that it's going to try and consume is that contingency. That's the whole essence and nature of having contingency, is covering yourself, right? But I think what's really interesting is, okay, so if there is enough risk and uncertainty and quantity growth, so on and so forth, what happens then if we completely consume that $20 worth of contingency? Then we get into what we call margin erosion. That's not good. Now, while it's not good, it's not the worst case scenario, because in the worst case scenario, what if we not only consume entirely our contingency, but we also entirely consume our margin? Then we start to be upside down on the project. And again, I think one of the massive benefits of doing a risk analysis is not just coming up with a single, hey, let's throw 20% on this project for contingency. By running a risk analysis, we get that complete range of outcomes, whether it's our highly optimistic P0, P10, through the much more worst case pessimistic scenario P100. And again, I think, Paul, a great example on the screen here, on the right-hand side, that P100 scenario, that's the worst case scenario. Look what it's showing. It's showing that because the base cost risk is occurring, it's completely consuming the contingency, but it's also then, we're going negative in our margin because consumption is $50, and because we didn't have sufficient contingency applied, we're now $15 in the red.
Yeah, we not only eroded our margin, we completely eliminated it.
We blew through it, eliminated it, and now we're making a loss on this project. Yeah. So again, I think from our experience in working with numerous contractors over the last 2 decades using this approach, this is really the key value. It's looking at the range of outcomes.
I would agree.
So, we've talked about kind of the value and some of the outputs. For those that have historically done any form of risk analysis, you're probably very familiar with really the key ingredients, the uncertainties and the risk events. Uncertainties traditionally have been modeled using what we call distributions. And these distributions can be in the form of what we call 3-point estimates, Paul, where we will try and define a minimum or optimistic and most likely and a pessimistic or maximum value. And as you can see on the left-hand side at the example there, that gives you that triangular distribution. And that's the distribution that the Monte Carlo analysis uses when doing its iterations and its sampling. While it's mathematically sound, it's actually quite difficult to extract from an engineer, a foreman, a superintendent, a discipline lead, those ranges, that min, most likely, max type of range. And so what I'm really excited about, sitting here now in 2019, after, again, 20 years worth of developing risk analysis tools, is we've come up with a much more effective approach for capturing those uncertainty ranges. Same thing for risk events, but hold that thought. So, Paul, with regards to the uncertainty capturing, again, rather than trying to extract those ranges from individuals, what we've realized is, wouldn't it be better to go out and canvass the expert opinion of multiple contributors? So in our simple example in the bottom left here, we're saying to the foreman, the planner, and the design lead, hey, what do you think about the 10-day forecast for this particular activity that the planner has put forward in the schedule? And in that example, the foreman's come back and said, actually, I think you've over-egged it. I think there's an opportunity to complete this in less time. And in fact, we can complete in 8 days. Conversely, the design lead is saying, hey, I have a very serious concern about our ability to execute in 10 days. I actually think we need 14 days. So what we've done here, Paul, is through the scorecarding interface that we have on the right-hand side, those 3 contributors, they just simply buy in or push back using that scorecard, and it's their opinion then that goes into the model. The model automatically generates the 8, the 10, the 14-day distribution.
Right, that's necessary for the simulation to effectively run. So that's what I think is so key about this specific process that we've introduced with Basis. Is risk can be such an academic exercise. If I were to go to one of my experts and ask them, hey, what's your 3-point estimate for this? Or are we going to use a triangular or uniform distribution? They're not going to know at all what I'm talking about, nor should they. That's not part of their job. So if we can minimize the exposure to the complexity of risk analysis while still getting the benefit, I think it's a massive leap forward.
It is, because again, going back to the whole input analysis output concept, the analysis is sound. The analysis is running critical path method. It's running the schedule. It's doing the thousands of iterations. That is unquestionable. It is mathematically correct. The outputs, again, I think we're getting better in reporting. The big unknown to date has really been how accurate are the inputs that go into that model. Well, you can't get more accurate than the team member's expertise, right?
Correct.
So talking of team member expertise, the other aspect to really the evolution of these risk models is, as an industry, I think it's fair to say that the expertise, the construction expertise, the design expertise, that is a very, very valuable human asset, and it takes years, if not decades, to build that up. Now, what we're seeing in the industry is, whether it's because of those experts migrating between organizations or potentially retiring out of the industry, that expertise is really hard to retain, and it's certainly very hard to nurture into the upcoming younger generation. Well, with the advent of what we call artificial intelligence for the first time now, that human expertise can be captured and stored in the computer. Now, that doesn't actually help. What then helps is the intelligent interrogation of that digitized human expertise, such that when we're building our risk model, for the first time now, the computer can actually come back with suggestions pertaining to, well, these are common risks that have happened on prior projects, or previously we lost this bid because of such and such, or even worse, we won this bid, but then we lost money because of the risks that happened. The computer now is able to make those suggestions and guide us through. And again, it's all about improving the ingredients that go into the risk model. So with that, I think, Paul, we should share with the audience exactly how we do this in practice.
That would be great.
Okay, so let's do a little 5-minute show and tell here. So we're going to start off in our schedule. So we'll take an existing schedule that I, as the planner, have put together. And again, this certainly isn't a webinar with regards to CPM scheduling, but I think it's suffice to say, okay, we've got the schedule to the point where we have defined not only our activities, we've defined the logic, all of the building blocks, calendars, so on and so forth. We have established what we believe to be as realistic as possible time forecast in the form of a CPM schedule. Now, in addition, I, as the planner, have also decorated the schedule with what I believe are risks and concerns that I really would like to resolve with my team before we decide on the bid price and the bid schedule that we move forward with. So I've had the luxury, even within my schedule development here, to identify risk events. And again, just touching on the AI capabilities, Paul, let's drop down to, say, construction and take a closer look at my construction scope. Not only can I identify construction risks here, if I am less familiar with the construction of, for example, a pipeline project, look at this. The computer, again, because it understands context, it's mining historical, both bids that we won and bids perhaps we didn't win, and it's coming back with common risks pertaining to those projects. So I have the massive luxury here of adding these risks into my model so that when the model spits out the answer for my bid, it's accounting for things that have happened in the past based on this type of project.
Right, and it makes it so, we're all human, right? We forget sometimes what happened on the last project. So most good planners worth their salt will go back and analyze prior projects, maybe analyze prior risk registers, but inevitably something can get missed, and the computer can help us make sure that we don't miss critical elements in our planning process.
And I think your statement there is maybe stated with rose-colored glasses, because I think in reality, it's really time-consuming and tedious to go back and try and pull out that historical information.
It is.
Yep. So you have the luxury, or the AI approach actually negates that pain, because it's automatically storing that historical information and representing it during the planning process. So here, the example being, I've said, okay, yeah, site access constraints that happen on previous projects, yes, it's a concern, but I only think there's a 25% chance it's going to hurt us, and I think we can resolve it within 2 months, and we really don't need to throw that much money at it to fix it. Okay, so a very effective way of decorating my construction scope there with that particular risk event. So that's me, the planner, developing my schedule. As we also then mentioned, the ability then to go ahead and ask multiple contributors to provide their input. And again, this scorecarding approach is so simple. The ability to say, okay, yes, I'm bought into the schedule, or for certain design elements, we need significantly more time. And again, the ability for those team members to identify risk events as well. So
really removes the complexity of having to understand everything from logic relationships to constraints. All of that stuff kind of gets removed so that the individual that's reviewing this plan at this point in time that is not a CPM planner or scheduler has the ability to provide input in a way that doesn't confuse.
It does, and it also means everybody's using, for example, the same scoring mechanisms, the same terminology, so on and so forth. So, accelerating all the way through to, okay, I as the planner have asked for feedback from my team before we put the bid together. Those team members, as you can see here, there's half a dozen team members. They have given me varying degrees of feedback. And here's where everything comes together, Paul. This is the magic, okay? So during the review process now, I can see, either for the project as a whole or for individual line items, I can see those differing opinions. So I can see, you know, Alan, Ben, Christy, so on and so forth. They've all provided their expertise, but those opinions are different. Now, because those opinions are different, what do we get? We get a distribution look. The computer's automatically created, in this case, a triangular distribution to represent those varying opinions. And again, in kind of the old-fashioned risk analysis approach, we would have to take our schedule, load it into a risk analysis tool, try and figure out those distributions, run the Monte Carlo simulation. Very, very time-consuming and an expensive process. In the new world, it's as simple as saying, okay, here's my schedule. The computer understands those opinions. Go ahead and apply those opinions and give me the risk-adjusted view of the schedule. So by turning on that toggle, boom, I can see the impact of the team member opinion directly in my schedule. Okay.
And that really represents one of the inputs, right? That's the first input in the plan, which is how confident are we, and in this example, the durations that we've built into the schedule itself.
Exactly. So this is really saying, okay, I am asking the computer to calibrate the schedule based on my team members' expertise. Not only that, Paul, I can ask the computer to calibrate my schedule to within a differing degree of confidence. If I want the most aggressive scenario that we possibly could bid, I'm going to go to, again, what we call the P0, okay? So the P0 scenario here, the computer's coming back with a finish date of the 9th of August, okay? Now, obviously, we're not going to bid with the most aggressive scenario. We may bid at, say, 50% certainty. Well, at 50% certainty, I can be sure that the project is actually not going to finish on the 9th of August, but instead is going to finish on the 30th of September. Okay, that's very, very insightful. Now, let's take that to the other extreme. What do I think the worst case scenario is? Let's go, you know, almost to the absolute worst mathematical case. Let's say take P95. That 30th of September date moves to the end of November. So now I've got the 23rd of November. So I'm 95% certain that I can complete this work on or before the 23rd of November. That's incredibly insightful as, you know, for a contractor that's putting together a bid.
So, and right now you've done it for just the uncertainty. So what's really interesting about it is you could say, hey, purely based upon the feedback on the durations within my schedule, absent the risk events that we've identified, how confident is my team in the schedule if I wanted to, you know, to take a P75, P95, whatever the value is, right? If I wanted to take one of those more optimistic, you know, protected scenarios, I can see exactly what my team member feedback resulted in without necessarily considering risk events at this point in time.
Yep, but I think more importantly then, you know, again, to properly add all the right ingredients to the cake, you do need to take into account the risk events that were identified. So again, it's as simple as turning on the toggle here. So on our 90% design element, we can see that the team member has raised a risk with regards to late approvals on design finalization. Okay, what's the impact on my project if that risk happens? Well, boom, turn it on. Oh my gosh, look, we didn't realize this, but actually it's going to hurt our design scope by 51 days. That has a knock-on effect. Look, now the completion date is through to the end of February the following year. There is no way I could calculate this in a you know, a complicated CPM schedule without doing this risk analysis. And I think what's so powerful about this is it's doing it in real time. I don't have to create a separate risk analysis model. And again, you know, we could look at, well, what's the impact of every single risk that's been identified with regards to design? I can see the knock-on effect, and I get to see the cumulative impact throughout my schedule as well. And then really the icing on the cake is to say, okay, well, let's look at remember the two reports, Paul, the what and the why. So the what scenario here is telling me everything from best case. So the best case I can expect is the 1st of November. The worst case is 23rd of May, obviously in the successive year. And then this tells me how much contingency. So this is how much additional buffer I need to add to my schedule to be competitive. And again, if I'm unhappy with how much contingency I have to add, then in order to adjust it, I need to know which risks to go and mitigate. This is the Y chart. Again, the tornado, it tells me which risks I need to focus on. These are the risks that will give me the biggest bang for the buck. If I can mitigate them, then this is how much win I can get with regards to time and money. Pretty cool stuff, huh?
It's very interesting stuff. So we've married the world of planning and risk analysis so that it's part and parcel to building a plan.
It is, and behind the scenes, obviously, the computer is going to compile all of those risks and uncertainties in the form of registers. So if you still, use kind of a risk register as a check the box or a tracking mechanism, then you get that for free as well.
Yep, and you can even see how often those risk events are getting mapped to elements within your schedule or across your projects, right? So how often are we running into site access constraints, in the 10 or 20 projects that we have ongoing right now?
Absolutely right. So it shows you how often they hit. And of course, then if the computer knows how often they hit pull, that information automatically can get stored back in what we call the knowledge library, such that on the next project, the computer has even more information to provide back to the planner. So that was a quick walkthrough of how today the risk analysis software within the InEight scheduling solution works. I think to add some context here, this is all very well. We've showed you what we believe to be a very clever next generation risk analysis tool. I think the question I would ask is, okay, so what? Does this stuff really work? And I think what's very interesting, Paul, is we're now starting to capture results and statistics around what are the relevant and correct contingency and margin percentages that a contractor organization should use to build out their bid price, right? And I think what we're seeing is, and it's still relatively early days, but for projects that are under the $1 billion threshold, then from a risk reward perspective, contingency should be hovering at about 4 to 5%, with your margin being just over double that. And I think what's very interesting again though is on true mega projects over the $1 billion mark, the amount of required contingency certainly more than doubles, but also you can demand more margin as well.
Right. I mean, you're taking on the whole risk reward, right? You're taking on a lot more risk by taking on a much larger project, and therefore you should have the capability to demand a little bit more margin, on that project. And that's what the analysis thus far has suggested. I think the other kind of key point to that is, for the number of organizations out there capable of executing a $1 billion plus project and have experience in doing so is a much smaller volume of contractors that can execute that type of work than contractors that can execute, under $1 billion. So because the number of people that can actually do that is smaller, you've got a scarce resource, and therefore they can demand more margin.
So I think the margin difference there is really interesting, as you explained, but also the fact that the required amount of contingency on a mega project is more, even as a percentage. And I think that's nothing more than the fact that as the size of a project increases, the complexity drives the amount of uncertainty and risk exponentially. And that's reflected in the fact that the required percentage contingency is not constant between the smaller projects and those mega projects.
Sure. The more work you're doing, the more chances you have for something to go wrong.
Yep. So I think the other area that we are laser focused on at the moment, and again, I think this is only going to get stronger over time, is the whole concept of time is money, right? And what we're really meaning there is, okay, so it's great that you're doing your schedule risk analysis, and it's obviously as we've proved very powerful that we're doing cost risk analysis, but aren't the two really linked together? Because as your project schedule risk exposure increases, let's say for example your design schedule slips by 20%, well obviously you're going to have a cost incurrence because of that time slippage, and so the ability to show the relationship between time and money from a risk adjusted schedule and risk adjusted cost estimate is very powerful. And I think what I find fascinating is, and there's an example of this, Paul, on the right hand side, the three colored curves there, the purple, the orange, and the red, they are our risk-adjusted, P10, P50, P90s, right? And what's happening there is in the early stages of the project, so actually through to February 2021, if you were just to look at the cost curve, the spend curve there, you would actually be mistaken into thinking, actually, we're doing better than planned. We're spending less money than we thought we were going to. Well, wrong. What's happening is because the work is getting delayed, you're not spending as much, but what it means is you're going to spend more on the back end of the project. And so being able to understand that time-weighted impact of spend over time is really, really something.
Right. So as an organization matures their risk process, they can not only determine what areas of scope using the common risk reporting charts that we looked at previously, the histogram and the tornado charts. That'll tell us where in the project do we have a higher degree of risk, but also when we start to plot it over time, we get to identify when in the project is our risk exposure exceeding our appetite.
Exactly. So I think what we've demonstrated, Paul, and certainly had a lively discussion on, is the fact that we are attacking the challenge of competitive contractor bidding using a three-pronged approach. And today we describe this as project intelligence, or PI. And the way we position this is the fact that our PI-driven approach to risk-adjusted cost estimating and scheduling is a combination of AI, which is the augmented or artificial intelligence that we described, the human intelligence aspect, where we're making it very easy for those contributors to provide their expertise with regards to risk, and then the risk intelligence, the clever reporting. And Paul, I'm going to try and say this without laughing, but maybe from a contractor perspective, it's not PI, which is project intelligence, but maybe it's BI, which is bid intelligence.
Bid intelligence. Yeah, I like that. I think we've coined a new phrase.
So, well, John, I think you are indicating to me that we have, I believe, a couple of questions.
Right, and if others have more questions and would like to not be bashful, please enter them in the question box on the screen there, and we'll get to them. We have a few minutes here. So our first question comes from Tim. He says, what are your views of moving toward a collaborative project risk model formed from owner and contractor viewpoints, saying this might be a base for a realistic risk-sharing contract?
So gosh, Tim, brilliant questions. So I truly believe the industry is moving away from the them and us scenario with regards to contractors and owners. I think it's interesting, obviously if there are two parties in a project, owner and contractor, their exposure to risk and their view of risk is going to be understandably different. I believe it's converging though. And I think, the likes of, whether it's a contract methodology or philosophy such as IPD or integrated project delivery, where instead of the traditional contractor and owner working separately and there's the firewall between them, IPD breeds this concept of everybody's working as an integrated business. And if we can march towards that, then yes, I think it makes absolute sense to get the opinion of both the owner and the contractor in the same cake mix when baking your risk model.
Baking your risk model cake?
Yes.
So I would agree, Dan, and us having sat through numerous sessions where we had both the owner and the contractor organization in the room. In the sessions where it worked, it was highly collaborative between the two organizations, and some of that was driven by the contract itself between those two entities. Where it was difficult for it to work is where, again, we talked about the differences between an owner's view of risk analysis and how they use those outputs, and the contractor's view of risk analysis and how they use those outputs. Where it hasn't worked well is when the owner organization is demanding we hit first production by a certain period of time and doesn't accept the risk that's being identified by the contractor organization. And we've seen that happen as well. which is probably really the root of Tim's question. So
you're right, and I think it goes back to owners are more schedule sensitive, whereas contractors are obviously cost sensitive. And I think for the integrated collaborative risk model to really work, both parties have to be very open when providing their inputs.
Yep.
Our next question is Tim once again. He wants to win a piece of that cake. He says, how has the tool, through historical data, helped determine the full impacts of a risk inclusive of knock-on or secondary impacts? He says, I'm not sure the Monte Carlo approach does this realistically.
So I think what Tim's asking there is, does the software properly account for secondary risk? I don't have the luxury of asking Tim on the phone here, but I think that's kind of the gist of his question. I think the proof of the pudding again is the fact that, okay, so in the software, you can build your risk-adjusted model and it spits out an answer. We have the luxury though today of taking that answer, and then when the project is completed, because the tool in the knowledge library captures the as-built, the reality, what really happened, we can compare the risk-adjusted forecast with the completed project and then calibrate accordingly. And I think, again, it's fair to say we are getting very, very good at those risk-adjusted forecasts accurately reflecting reality. Now, there's a whole detailed discussion about secondary risk and correlating between primary risk and driver of risk. Again, without getting into the weeds of it, we've made that more streamlined, just simple things. For example, when a contributor defines a risk in the product, they have no choice but to differentiate between the cause, the effect, and the impact. They have to define those as three separate entities, which overcomes some of the risk of double dipping between a primary and a secondary risk.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Paul. That wraps up our Q&A segment. To learn more about InEight, as well as our planning, scheduling, and risk solutions, visit InEight.com and click on the Request a Demo button. And make sure to mark your calendars for the next webinar in this series. It's October 23rd, and it's titled Why You Should Care About Short Interval Planning. Thank you for watching. This concludes our webinar.